Thank you so much, and welcome to this panel. That was an extraordinary speech that we heard, very inspirational. And I do want to start with my thanks, but above all, congratulations. I would even say awe at the organization of this event. I stand in full admiration for the care and for the diligence and for the creativity that has brought us all together. This is a special session which is aimed at trying to help us to have a common frame of reference for the very complex, sensitive, one could even say tricky, issues that are the core of this event. The questions about cohesion, social cohesion, questions of resilience. What is it that we're talking about? Because it takes us to the most fundamental issues of the interesting times, the troubled times that we find ourselves in. The poly-crisis, we call it, the perma-crisis, which seems to have taken on new dimensions, even within the past few days. We heard from the president many ideas of a lucid diagnosis, but also a set of practical ideas that involve both the lessons that we come to hear to gain from Singapore's experience, from Singapore's models, from Singapore's lessons, but also setting them into a global context where we're looking at everything from the family, from individuals, all the way to the global stage. I love the metaphor that the president used of the quilt, the beauty of a quilt as an art form, as a tradition, one that has the potential to bring together very different elements in different ways, and which has its own fragility, given the way that it is stitched together. So I think that that is a metaphor that we can use as we look to these somewhat abstract concepts of cohesion, social cohesion, multiculturalism, diversity, and above all, resilience, and the idea of building harmony. I want to emphasize that those of you who have questions and comments should use the QR code and Pigeonhole. I will be receiving any questions. There are none yet, but we are hoping to have a good part of this discussion that will be dedicated to responding to the concerns of this extraordinary audience that's here. So let me turn now to introductions to what I think is a very special, remarkable panel, which exemplifies the themes of multiculturalism and diversity. We will hear first from Mike Hardy, OBE, who is a diplomat, an academic, and above all, I think, a leader on issues of peace, with quite an emphasis on Southeast Asia, but also a global perspective. So Mike will speak first. He'll be followed online, and I can see her, I guess you can see her as well, Katherine Fieschi. She was born in Senegal, has navigated all her life between France and Canada, and I think Europe and other parts of the world. She's now has a sort of European label, but she has focused always on identity politics and the problems of populism. How do we navigate so many of those issues? And third, Aaron Maniam, who is from Singapore and who is a personal exemplar of multiculturalism. In fact, he describes himself as gloriously hyphenated and brings in, I think, most cultural, religious, ethnic in his person. He is going to help us to understand what are the issues and the challenges, and I think challenge us also to think about how each one of us, from where we're sitting, can help to address those. So I think as we think about this, as you listen to each of these presentations and formulate your own comments and questions, remember that we're talking about everything from the individual, and the president focused the personal, almost the isolated individualism, through the family, the community, the nation, Singapore, the global. I personally am very focused on the G20, bringing the religious wisdom and ideas into the global, but the United Nations, ASEAN, so many other dimensions of how do we address these issues. But first, I think, to Mike Hardy, let's start with how do we understand what's happening and how do we think about what we do about it?
Catherine, I'm going to stand up if I may. The President talked about respect, and I'm humbled by the quality of this audience, and I prefer to stand up. And it's very hard to follow this articulate and coherent account that we heard from the President, but I'll attempt to share some of the perspectives that I think are interesting. We have an amazing opportunity over the next 2 or 3 days to push forward some of the ideas that have been expressed and some of the anxieties we brought with us. This is a room full of believers. We understand the issues, I hope well. We're committed to building our understanding, building our confidence. And I'd like to talk about 3 things through the lens of this region, ASEAN region, where I've done most of my recent work. And the 3 things I want to do, try to add to what we've already heard. First, I want to talk about the pace of change, not just change that the President described, but the acceleration that we're confronting and the impact that that has on the task at hand. And secondly, because my interest is in leadership and in public leadership in particular, pleased the President referred to that, the responsibility of public leaders matters. We have choices to make, and I want to articulate some of the choices that I think are important. And finally, I'm a believer that even in this time of uncertainty and the unknown, we must invest in being better about our knowledge about things. And I want to focus on how we should invest in knowledge to try and add to some of the dimensions raised about what we should be doing. Let me start, however, by moving back to a powerful, an iconic quote from a casualty of some of the issues raised by the President. In 1992, a name that will be familiar to some of you, Rodney King, was a minority who was beaten savagely by a majority institutionalized police force. For whatever reasons, we don't have to go. At the time, it provoked enormous reaction. And we know that the traumas and catastrophic conflicts in the world have huge implications for peaceful communities. After the acquittal of the policeman that had beaten him, a year later, Rodney King was heard to say, a passion plea for us to think more carefully about the issues that had been going on in that context. Please, we can get along here, he said. We can all get along, and I mean, we're all stuck here for a while. Let's try and work it out. Very powerful call about place and about this inevitability of coexistence. And I was impressed by the President saying, you know, this is more than coexistence, it's more than tolerance, it's more than the celebration of diversity. In ASEAN particularly, we have great examples of the issues in context, the realities, the pace of change, driven by historical, political, economic, cultural issues. Southeast Asia is described and behaved by its very diverse, yet strong traditions, ethnicities, and socio-economic conditions. And I know Catherine well enough, Catherine Zoom, we'll call you. It's going to talk a lot about disparity. But that's the key summary word for ASEAN. Disparity, whether it's between or within nation states. Extreme differences in growth rates. Extreme issues of difference between urban and rural divergences, between income inequalities. All fueling tension, particularly for those who feel excluded and left behind. Other distinctive changes at pace include aging populations, generational divides, complex ethnic combinations, and bringing both the riches of diversity with potential social fragmentation. So uneven, discriminatory impacts from public policy are changing the sense of belonging for many in our nation states. The region is struggling with governance issues, very limited public trust, and polarizing, as we've heard, of political views in both democratic and more authoritarian states. And elsewhere, the region is not immune either to the accelerated pace of social media and digital communication, hate speeches, and the rhetorics of nationalism. We then have the climate to worry about. The number of people on the move will grow exponentially, and the number of new arrivals and new accommodations will just increase. So addressing these issues requires a comprehensive strategy, as we've heard, promoting inclusivity, respect, and a shared sense of purpose, as the President outlined. We can't change the world we're in, but maybe, and it's my interest in leadership, we can change our approach to these contextual relations. So what choices are we faced? We face the choice how to take control of where we are. The choice between fragmentation and solidarity. That's a choice that we can take together. The public sector leaders and civil society working, as we know, is important with the private sector. There's a difference in my work between the promise of social cohesion and the promises of social cohesion. And we need to think about the difference as we move forward over the next couple of days. A difference between looking forwards and looking at, each against the backcloth of a fast-changing context. The promise concerns potentials. If we get it right, the aspirations, the destinations are more likely to happen. This is what I call in my work as a movement, a direction of travel. Adaptive and agile public leaders are more likely to take us there. As opposed to the promises refer to the assumed benefits and success of and for cohesive societies, a better place in a moment of time. So conceptually, this helps us recognize that social cohesion is rarely a destination at which we arrive. More likely, given the current context and the pace of change, it's an assessment of how far and how fast we're making progress towards this better place. The difference between a movement and a moment in time is critical for public leadership choices. And let me conclude from looking at refreshing our thinking about promoting social cohesion. From my current work, it's very clear, and from a lot of the work that all you are doing, I know, it's important to distinguish between the social relationships that are important, the horizontal relationships between and within communities, measuring the degree to which values and interests are shared and support a sense of belonging. Interestingly, given the Southeast Asia context, we might look also to refresh our approach to shared values, so often dominant in the literature, to work not just on sharing, but on creating values together, shifting from this moment in time to the movement to which I referred. The evidence and feelings around nation building, Indonesia and Malaysia came to mind, saw the introduction and focus on newly independent states, facilitating the development of new priorities for its complex and diverse population. And this may be very different from the more firmly and historically established value sets elsewhere in the world. Secondly, there's a structural vertical relationship between public leaders and institutions and the people in their communities, reflecting the impact of unfairness or inequalities, of system discriminations or exclusions. And we can further refresh our thinking about the real significance of people feeling valued and being engaged. Finally, my final comment really, public choice means leaders must, in my view, invest in knowledge. And I want you also, I'd ask you to reflect on this over the next couple of days of conversation. Uncertainty and the unknown need not be as constraining as we think it is. A focus on knowledge about roles, about contributions and purpose is really, really significant. And there are 4 knowledge domains in my thinking. Why we need to invest in knowing more. This is where the academy, I think, can contribute powerfully to that other nexus of leadership. Firstly, what do we need to know? We need to know about what the challenge really is. Not assume that we know the difficulties and the obstacles that we face. We can become stronger and more influential in uncertainty by investing, not in anticipating all eventualities, but be clear about the challenges that we face. Secondly, we need to invest in knowledge about what's possible rather than what's desirable. We need to invest in the possibilities because that helps define the direction of travel rather than an overemphasis on the destination. And thirdly, we have to strongly acknowledge that it's important to invest in knowing who should be on our team, who should we include in the journey, in the development, in the design, who should be consulted. We can't do it on our own. And finally, public leaders, I think, should be very clear and invest in knowledge about their competence, what they can do well and what they do less well. In my work, the 3 things that really stand out as critical to carry with you in your suitcase on this journey is firstly being open, taking a long time before you close things down, remaining open. Secondly, continuing to remain curious, to be driven by questions, not answers and solutions. And finally and importantly, let's be much more comfortable in our journey with paradox. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. You've given us, I think, the challenge of going towards a movement and several challenges, particularly on how to approach this, including with our minds, with knowledge. So let's turn now to Katherine, who's speaking to us through the airwaves, we hope with a stable internet. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for including me. It's a real delight to participate, if only virtually. It's also really very bizarre to see myself so huge on that screen, on my tiny screen, I must admit. Katherine, you very kindly introduced me and referred to the fact that I was a sort of slightly living embodiment of the hesitation of belonging also to different nations, North American, African, European. And I suppose that one of the ways that I want to start this conversation is to say that as a product of this sort of travel and of my family, I grew up with two completely contrasting and often conceived of as opposite models of how one manages diversity and turns it into one's advantage. I grew up on the one hand with a French model, which is thought of as integrationist and has been in the past assimilationist in its format to create nationhood. But I'm also Canadian, and so I've also grown up with an allegiance to multiculturalism, to a very different conception of how one achieves nationhood, indeed, a very different kind of nationhood through the kinds of incentives that multiculturalism creates. Both of these models, I think, are often reduced to caricature. The harshness of something like the French model, I think, is overemphasized when in fact there's a very heavy dose of romanticism in the French model and in the conception of the nation. And the Canadian model is often thought of as very feel good, when in fact, anyone who knows the history of Canada and the 20th century history of Canada around the emergence of multiculturalism knows that it was in many respects a genius stroke of realpolitik by Pierre Trudeau in order to manage the Québécois difference. Despite these caricatures, these models do exist. But what I do see in Europe, in the US, even in Canada today, is that it is more and more difficult to thrive on diversity, to manage diversity, no matter what the model that is at play. In the UK, we've seen not just a fragmented nation, but also a highly polarized nation, both leading up to the Brexit referendum and in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. In Poland, too, in Europe, we see a highly polarized nation. In Germany, we see more fragmentation, as well as, for example, in the Netherlands. But what we do see everywhere is something that your president has quite rightly referred to, and that is the growth of populism and of the far right, the radical right, everywhere. And so when we talk about fragmentation and polarization, I want to say that I think that fragmentation clearly, by definition, makes cohesion more difficult. I think it makes the work of policymakers much more difficult. It raises, in a sense, the complexity stakes. And by raising the complexity stakes, by testing the mechanisms of not just representative democracy, but in many of the advanced democracies, sophisticated welfare states, sophisticated mechanism for redistribution. Fragmentation tests the limits, I think, of these models. And by creating frustration, by creating resentment, I think this is manipulated also by populist parties. But I would argue, nevertheless, that a polarized situation is a much worse situation. If we take polarization to mean societies and their polities, in which segments of the population really are very sharply divided into often two opposing groups, sometimes more, because of ideological or religious, sometimes ethnic or linguistic lines, and these differences tend to overlap rather than crisscross, right? It's important to reflect on what we mean by a polarized society, and that is a society where when you know one piece of a person's background or one of their preferences, you can deduct where they will stand on almost everything else, and there will be an opposing group that is equally coherent, equally cohesive in its rejection and of the other and in its sense of we-ness. And I think that, this is what is feeding much more directly the growth of the radical right. This is what is feeding much more directly the low trust, both in those who are in other groups, but also the low trust in our leaders to manage this situation. This is a situation where, in fact, our political opponents are turned into our enemies. And I think we know, research shows that voters in polarized societies are much more willing to sacrifice democratic principles and norms in order to protect their own interest. Once the other side is deemed to be an enemy, you will go to great destructive lengths to protect your own acquis, your own group interests from them. Populism in advanced democracy thrives on this us-them dynamics. It thrives on polarization, and indeed, it generates polarization. And as the president rightly pointed out, the far right in its growth creates this hugely problematic situation. It creates mistrust, but I would argue also in passing that it creates revolt. Multiculturalism was created and devised to manage these divisions in ways that would create cross-cutting incentives to collaborate across existing groups, across existing differences. It built on a foundational set of insights, the first of which probably, if we leave Aristotle out of it, was James Madison's Federalist 10 paper, who pointed out that, the greater the variety of interests and groups and the more overlapping connections there were, the further away the risk of tyranny. And since him, political scientists have expended an incredible amount of energy showing that actually fragmentation can be difficult, differences can be difficult, but actually people who are pulled among conflicting forces will be forced to collaborate, forced to negotiate. This is what the institutions of multiculturalism create. They create these incentives to collaborate and negotiate across groups. And so I would argue that despite the exaggerated reports of multiculturalism's death or multiculturalism's waning, even though these problems are of polarization and of populism and radical right can be seen across our democracies and our advanced democracies, where multiculturalism is still espoused, it is still delivering better than other models. I want to conclude, though, on three fundamental challenges that faces even the best organized multiculturalist societies, and I would put Singapore and I would put Canada in this basket. The first is a terrible paradox, since Mike used the word first, and that is that by creating forces that pull us toward the center rather than the extremes, we know that actually those centrist politics often become technocratic, they often become managerial, they hold less attraction because less excitement for voters. And so paradoxically, the technocracy and the managerial nous can often breed disinterest, apathy, and then frustration. So it's a terrible paradox, but we must acknowledge it. Sometimes more politics is a guarantee of more involvement, more engagement, and therefore more cohesion and more belonging. The second point and the second challenge is that has already been raised is the work of social media, which is definitely a plus, as the president quite pointed out quite rightly. But it is also a challenge with its rabbit holes and echo chambers, its capacities to make us feel both connected and yet terribly isolated within smaller and smaller groups that are closer and closer to our opinions, thus reinforcing them. But the final challenge, and I think that this is the one that we must really face head on, is that of inequality. And it's inequality of all kinds. It's inequality of access, it's inequality of education, it's inequality of representation that breeds frustration, but it's also a very basic kind of income inequality, wealth inequality. And I predict the next political time bomb in advanced democracies in Europe and in the United States and in Canada, access to housing, which is fomenting great resentment. I think that by creating persistent and visible disparities, inequality is going to be the biggest challenge that is going to cut across our multicultural institutions. And I would conclude on this sad fact, which is that what I notice is that the feeling of being left behind is in fact starting to become the only one that people start to share across our nations. And that is a very dangerous resentment, a very dangerous feeling, this feeling left behind to share. It's very dangerous for our democracies. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Katherine. I think you've given us a very vivid sense of the challenges and the difficulties of looking at this question of multiculturalism and social cohesion, even in very different systems, and some of the particular challenges we face today. And your challenges are very telling. I think the one that I also lose sleep over very often is this challenge of inequality, both in reality but also in the way that it moves and changes people. I'm acutely conscious that we have not very much time and we have already a number of questions, so just want to let you keep that in mind as I turn to our exemplar of hyphenation, Aaron.
Thank you, Katherine. I'll stand up as well for this. One of the hard things about going last in a panel like this after the president has spoken is I was actually tempted to just say we should do the coffee break earlier because we've discussed everything. But in the interest of adding maybe just a tiny bit to this discussion, I thought I would start by explaining what Katherine meant by this idea of glorious hyphenation. My father is half Tamil and half Portuguese Eurasian, the same Portuguese who came to Goa and then Malacca and then Singapore after that. My mother is part Malay and almost half Pakistani with a smattering of Chinese in her, from a Chinese baby, my great-great-grandmother who was adopted by a Pakistani family and raised Muslim. My dad converted to Islam when he married my mom from Roman Catholicism, but his family is also quite huge, and so we celebrate nearly everything because several of my aunts have married Hindu and Buddhist men. And I share this because, on the one hand, this can be terribly confusing, but what I love about that experience is that I think it's reminded me about the fact that social diversity, social pluralism, social cohesion cannot start if we don't have a sense of our individual diversity and cohesion and pluralism. And Katherine, the notion of, Zoom Katherine, right, talked about the we-ness. I'm going to differentiate between Zoom Katherine and Room Katherine here because it'll just help us all. So the we-ness that we have has to start with a sense of our own me-ness as well. And I begin with this because the thoughts that I have to share today will come from all of these different diversities, right? The fact that I draw from these different ethnicities, I'm wearing a Laotian jacket that I chose with friends from all over ASEAN when we did a visit to a Laotian weaving factory. I speak Malay, I don't speak Tamil, unlike many other Indians here in Singapore, but I try to contain these multitudes. And I wanted to share some thoughts today from the different parts of these multitudes. First of all, from the fact that I've worked for a long time in public management and now teach on public management at the School of Government at Oxford. And one of the key insights there is exactly this notion of how we manage polarities or paradoxes, as both Mike and Katherine have referred to. And I wanted to mention what some of these paradoxes might be that we do need to try to not just resolve, but to transcend. The whole workshop that I do in this afternoon, actually, for the skills sessions, will be about polarities rather than polarization. And some of these polarities that we have to learn to bring together will, I think, be about how much we need to coordinate, how much we must direct in social cohesion, versus how much we can leave to spontaneity and diversity, even if that's untidy. How much do we balance between primordial and ethnic identities, as well as civic identities that pertain to the values that we might adhere to? How much of cohesion has to be top-down versus bottom-up? How much of it is about ideas versus cohesion of doing? If you get a chance, have a chat with Harvey Whitehouse and Alex Lowe later today, because I spoke to both of them yesterday, and they're both really interested in the doing work of cohesion, not just the conceptual and the abstract. How much do we learn then from the wisdom of history, and how much do we bring in the innovation of the new in work that pertains to social cohesion? And the way we have a panel on Thursday which will look at cohesion forward, which is all about where exactly the future lies and not just the shackles of the past. So the more we can manage these polarities, the stronger I think our attempts at cohesion can become. But a third aspect is the fact that currently I teach a lot on technology, and a lot of what the President said about tech were very, very striking to me. Because he mentioned that we need shared hopes, shared purpose, and shared endeavor. But the reality is that, and he explicated this in great detail, the reality is that there's a lot that we don't share because of technology. We don't share information anymore. We don't have a shared conception of what we are seeing. We disagree on what facts and truth might be. We don't always have shared interests, and where we do, those shared interests are sometimes made to be eroded by the volume, the virulence, the virality, and the velocity of the information that's spreading out there. We don't have shared spaces anymore. Even within our homes, people are all watching different shows on Netflix and Disney Plus or some other streaming platform rather than gathering in front of that screen that the President talked about. We don't even use that screen sometimes because all of us are on our laptops or our phones, engaging in a different digital space. And because of all that, shared values are much harder to come by. Now, I bring up all of this because there's a concept in technology teaching called Conway's Law. He's a programmer who wrote a lot in the 1950s, who says that when systems adopt new technologies or new innovation, they do so in ways that mirror their existing communication structures. Now, what this means is that if we are already distributed and democratic, we're very likely to adopt technology in that sort of way. If we are autocratic and directive, we will adopt technology in that way. And I think what we have to be really careful about here is how we adopt tech in ways that might actually be feeding into the pre-existing human instincts and proclivities that have always existed. This is why the inequality problem that Zoom Katherine talks about are so important, because they are inequalities that predated technology, but are becoming much worse and accentuated and exacerbated by those techs. So that's the notion of technology, and I think they will pervade a lot of what we talk about in the coming few days. Fourth, I wanted to say a little bit about policy. Right? We've heard a lot about policy from the President and how urban design, education, and digital policy will shape what we do. I thought I would just say one thing to add to that, which is that all policy has to be based on a fundamental bedrock of reciprocity. And reciprocity is hard to do in the world of social cohesion. Because reciprocity doesn't just mean I do unto you as I would like to have you do unto me. It also means the privileges that I want for myself and my community must apply to others. The restrictions that I hope others will have applied to them must also apply to my community and me. I can't judge others by the worst of their work while I judge myself by the best of mine or my tradition. And I can't judge others by their impact, but judge myself by my intent if I don't then actually extend that favor outwards as well. So policy will be hard to do precisely because that bedrock of reciprocity is not always an easy one to achieve once we realize how much we have to give up to actually live together in a way that can be mutually generative. Lastly, I wanted to say a quick word about metaphors. In my free time, I attempt to write poetry. It doesn't always work out because there's so many other things that happen, like being in the worlds of technology, management, and policy. But fundamentally, actually, I've been writing poetry longer than I've been doing anything else. And when I hear metaphors about the quilt, what I also think about are some of the more difficult metaphors that we've had in the world of social cohesion. Flawed metaphors like a melting pot, or even a salad bowl, which don't quite bring everything together the way we need them to. I love the metaphor of the quilt. I think of the metaphor of the orchestra and the musical group that we heard this morning, and how when they come together, they create a music that cannot be created by the individual parts. And I think fundamentally of the metaphor of a moral ecology, an ecology where we are all interrelated, but we are morally related as well. So we're not just an ecology in the way a lion can eat a gazelle with moral impunity. Can we bring that moral language into what we do? And I'll just leave you with the thought of saying, what would your metaphor be for social cohesion? Is it a quilt? Is it a moral ecology? Is it a river with a fundamental source that leads to different places? The language we choose will define what we do, because they will define the very diversities that we as individuals and our societies are made up of. Thank you very much.
Great stuff.
Well, thank you very much to all three of you. I think you've given us inspiration, but also much food for thought. And I love the way that Aaron ended in focusing on, in a sense, where we started, which is with the questions of language and the words that we're using, and how we think about resilience and cohesion, multicultural diversity, all these other sensitive issues. I also like the moral ecology and the analogy of music. It's interesting, I think there's research that shows that the profession that is most positive is an orchestra conductor, the highest level of satisfaction, because you create beauty and you have at least a control, but within a group. I also come back to the point you made about reciprocity, which I think is reflected in the Golden Rule, which is one of the ideas that we find, I think, that cuts across every religious, every cultural tradition, that do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think another idea that cuts across all is the blind men and the elephant, though I love the Rumi version, which is that the elephant is actually in a dark shed, and if you just put some light on it, you might understand what the elephant is better than the blind men groping with different parts. We have much less time left than we had hoped. So I have 18 questions, and I think we will come back and study and reflect on the questions, but they come really into two groups. So I'll basically highlight a little bit about what I see as the groups from my glance at the pigeonhole wisdom that we have, and then turn to the three panelists with one. But they fall, I think, into two categories. One is reflections on the meaning of social cohesion and different understandings of it, some of the challenges that we face. And then a second group that are pointing us towards practical solutions. In other words, what do we do? What is the answer? So just to give you an example, Kevin Thomas says, is social cohesion effectively mobilized as a grassroots initiative or top-down policy-driven endeavor? What's the correct balance? Dr. Katherine Kitcat says that Dr. Katherine Zoom pointed out inequality. How do we reduce the gap? How do we balance taking into account different religious beliefs when creating policy? How do we encourage and start the right type of thinking on how we move forward? That moves us into the second category. Do we tend to underappreciate structural economic factors when considering issues of social cohesion? I think the president referred to that, and this, the the fear of being left behind, which does seem to drive so much of the concern in so many countries. Beyond coexistence, what do you think are the principles of social cohesion that is shaped by or is shaping? How can the right balance be struck between maintaining unique identities? So the question that I'm going to suggest, which I actually don't even see anymore, but I know they want to project the question on the screen, is, are there examples of success and failure in Southeast Asia and in other regions? In other words, what do we point to when we look at the policy issues that several of the panelists have highlighted? So let me see. I can't actually see that question that I was looking at. Let's try this from Su Ying. Do you have examples where policy promoting social cohesion works in one country but not in another? How do we know if a policy or strategy is applicable in one place? So what we can do with that is turn to each of the panelists. We have, I have to say, you can't see this, but I can, 4 minutes and 23 seconds. So we'll start with Mike, go to Katherine, and then to Aaron for very quick comments that try to bring us a little bit to where do we go and what are the solutions.
So I think it's a very complex question to deal with quickly, but I want to apologize for that because this is a complex area of work. But I don't think it's easy to point to things that work in one place and another without considering what's going on behind that. So I think to populate my sort of passion for movement, we have to be prepared to introduce new ways of looking at the issues that we're confronting. So I look with interest at those policy decisions which are focused basically by looking at what we did before and making judgments about them and seeing if we can move forward. And also experimenting with the likelihood in the future that we'll be in areas that will be completely unknown. So really interesting to see here in Singapore the real success, in my view, of the integrated housing, which hasn't been featured elsewhere and is very difficult. Many places elsewhere now are looking at the paucity of interaction that the President and we've talked about that can be helped with common space, with shared spaces. But you know, on a journey towards a different place, setting our direction of travel, I think we have to get better at doing three things. Firstly, we have to know what of our past experience we should treasure and hang on to and keep going with, and be resilient. We need to know which and things of our past experience we need to discard, to remove. We've got to be courageous to do that. And finally, we've got to find ways of innovating, of bringing new ideas forward. Those three things, treasuring, discarding, and innovating, we don't do very well. And that's led us, I think, to sample events and policies and experiences and seek to look at what other people do. But actually, we have to start at home. As Aaron, you said, we have to start with ourselves, our communities, our families, our communities, our nations, and work outwards.
So I'm afraid that we have to come back to my favorite answer to these kinds of questions, which is it's complicated.
It's complicated.
So Katherine, do you have a quick
That was
comment?
a lot quicker. Yeah.
I was just going to say that it's interesting in terms of inequality. If we take, European economies and the Canadian polity, and we take the United States, we know that there are great differences in terms of redistribution in welfare systems. And you would think that, Europe, particularly maybe Northern Europe, but a country like France is similar, vast redistribution, so very powerful safety net. And the fact is that way of addressing inequality doesn't seem to temper polarization or fragmentation. So it's interesting because here are systems that are designed to do this, designed to redress imbalance, and yet they don't create the expected result. And I think that this is It's interesting, if you look at all of the surveys and polls, many of which I've been involved in, about the kinds of resentments that people have, it is this sense, in a way, that some people deserve to be helped more than others, that some people aren't pulling their weight. And that's not, that isn't necessarily tinged with any kind of racial resentment. It's just a sense that some people are getting something for free, or it's not clear why. And I would conclude on saying that I think this takes us back to where Aaron left off, which is the idea of the moral ecology,
Yeah.
the reinterpretation of reciprocity. Why do we have these systems in place? What are the shared values that they're supposed to protect? What is the aim? What is the objective? It's not just about management. It's actually about well-being, about happiness, about justice. And I think that this needs to be re-explored
Okay,
together if we want to address inequality.
The screen has gone red, but I want to make sure Aaron has one last minute or half minute.
Will do. I'll do it in a minute. And Katherine, thank you so much for doing this at 3 o'clock in the morning, your time. It must be so hard to do that. I really just have one thought in response to both your question and the two clusters that you mentioned, Katherine, because I think the best things that I've seen work are where communities look not just to protect and preserve their interests, but protect and preserve the interests of others as well. Right? When I served as a diplomat in Washington, D.C., whenever we met with different community groups, they always said that the best thing they could do was help others to preserve their interests. And when we do that, we start to create elements of that quilt, or the moral ecology, that actually interconnects us far more. When you find yourself focusing purely on your own community, that's usually when it starts to get very brittle and where the differences become reified and reinforced. And why do these things matter? They matter, first of all, because they come from a meaning of cohesion that's a bit more subtle than just fight or flight, that's a bit more subtle than just protection of ourselves, or what I like to call a cohesion of necessity. Right? This moves us beyond to a cohesion of goodwill, and also a cohesion of action, where we're doing things together because we're in the same boat, right? Of being faced by problems that are planetary and far more boundaryless than they might have been before. And these are also then solutions that embody the paradoxes and the polarities that all three of us have been talking about. A lot of the questions you mentioned, Katherine, in terms of practical solutions, were asking, how do we choose between these seemingly opposed forces, right? Grassroots versus top-down, structural versus cultural, economic versus social factors. I really do mean it. The session I do this afternoon will be all about that, right, when we talk about polarities. But the sign-ups are done, so you can't now come into them. Please don't stress the poor organizers out on this. But the reason I bring this up is because when we adopt a polarity mindset rather than a problem mindset, seeing something as something to be managed rather than a problem to be solved, then we can adopt more nuanced approaches. We can see the movement across those extremes as just our organizations breathing out and breathing in, rather than being disparate choices. We need to do both all the time, across time. And the key to this is that neither side of these opposing factors should always and dominantly win. Right? We should always be oscillating and kind of moving between them in as delicate a dance as possible. If we can embody that and contain those multitudes, then I suspect that's where we'll start getting to some really rich practical solutions. Thanks, Katherine.
Well, I think we must reluctantly bring this session to a close. I think it has achieved the objective of setting out the complexity of the issues, both with concern and with illustrations of what we face as a global and a local community, but also some of the directions that we need to look as we look towards solutions. I will ask the organizers to make sure that I and my colleagues get copies of all of the questions so that we can reflect on them and continue the discussion over the days ahead. Thank you to all of you who did master Pigeonhole and give us these questions. And thank you to all the panelists and to all of you.